to his legacy. I'll share my screen now. Can you enable me to share my screen?
Sakti, before the lecture, we'll have the citation to Dr. Seshadri.
1 minute, sir. Sir, before we start the talk, let us complete the citation. The citation for Dr. Professor M.S. Seshadri sir will be done by the APA President, Dr. Ravi sir.
Sir, respected speaker, Dr. Seshadri, this is the citation. Association of Physicians of India, Tiruchirappalli branch, feels honored to invite Professor Dr. M.S. Seshadri to deliver the prestigious Dr. Sundaram Endowment Lecture on 13th December 2020. Professor Dr. M.S. Seshadri has an MBBS and MD General Medicine from Madras University, a PhD from Sydney University, and is a fellow of Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. Since 1977, he has held various positions on and off at Christian Medical College, Vellore, beginning as Senior Research Officer, with his most recent post being the Head of Department of Endocrinology. He is a highly decorated doctor with awards and medals throughout his academic career. He has also authored over 100 papers, completed 24 competitive research grants, and is a reviewer of 5 medical journals. He is a very highly regarded teacher in the medical community and has been a professor of medicine and endocrinology at Christian Medical College, Vellore. He has extensive experience in research, having been involved in pharmaceutical trials with Eli Lilly, Pfizer, Clinigen, and published in the New England Journal of Medicine. He is a life member of various academic professional bodies, including the Association of Physicians of India, the Endocrine Society of India, the Research Society for the Study of Diabetes in India, Indian Clinical Epidemiology Network, and serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Association of Physicians of India. He has dedicated more than 25 years of his work to diabetes, endocrinology, and metabolic disorders, and has a keen interest in to continue the prevention of osteoporosis. He is the medical director of the Thirumalai Mission Hospital. He is an empathetic physician and an excellent diagnostician. He is known for his thoroughness of good medical practices. He is a doctor of choice for chronic medical problems and is a unique, valuable resource for our hospital and a boon to our community. At Thirumalai Mission Hospital, he ensures the practice of evidence-based medicine and enables a high level of adherence to standards of medical practice. He is eager to train young medical professionals to engage in the right practice of medicine. API Tiruchirappalli branch takes a pride in presenting this citation to Professor Dr. M.S. Seshadri on the occasion of Dr. Sundaram Endowment Lecture on 13th December 2020. Welcome you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Without much ado, I think I'll go ahead with my lecture. You will permit me to share my screen. Can you enable?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Just a minute. Yes, you can, sir. Are you able to share, sir?
Yes, yes. Are you able to see my slide?
Yes, sir.
In the interests of gender equality, I have titled this His or Her Story. Now, this is a picture of Sir William Osler, one of the 4 founding professors of Johns Hopkins University, man of many talents. To his credit, he was the first one to introduce what is called a journal club for education of young physicians. He started the Quarterly Journal of Medicine, which is still a highly regarded journal. He took his students to the bedside. Students who were tied up with their books. He told them, you need to go to the bedside in order to learn clinical medicine. There is no other way. He told the students, listen to your patient because he is telling you the diagnosis. He also used to have this line for all his students. The good physician treats the disease. The great physician treats the patient who has the disease. There is a very important difference here. We can't just have an orientation towards the disease. We need to have an orientation to the patient who actually has the disease. If you don't have that rapport with the patient, you really will not be able to do a very good job. Of all the diagnostic tools at the disposal of a physician, there is one that is least expensive, most valuable, but in the current days, often underutilized. This is the patient's clinical history. History, as you know, is an orderly documentation of events. It depicts the chronological sequence of events in a patient's explanation or description of his illness. It's a non-judgmental presentation of facts. You can't be judgmental. And true historians actually present information without any distortion. Any distortion in the history can lead to a wrong conclusion. A good physician does the same thing that a good historian does with the information that he derives from his patients. As you all know from your undergraduate days, you've all been taught that the components of a good history are the presenting complaints, what brought him to the doctor, the chronological sequence of events which constitutes the history of presenting complaint, past medical illnesses, hospital admission, surgical procedures, family history, and in particular a family tree if an inherited disorder is suspected, a personal history that will look into his habits, bowels, micturition, and in a lady menstrual cycles, an occupational history, particularly getting details of occupational exposure to a risky environment which may contribute to the disease, a socioeconomic history which will tell you something about his background, his income, family, societal background, a drug history, all current drugs, past drugs, allergies, and drugs from all systems of medicine, particularly in our country. I will illustrate the importance of each of these aspects of history taking with true stories. The first case is a situation where a doctor actually climbed up or barked up the wrong tree. A 60-year-old male went to an orthopedic surgeon for bilateral knee pain. He was told that he had osteoarthritis of the knees. He also mentioned that he does need to get up to void urine 3 times at night, and that process of getting up from the bed is difficult because of the knee pain. He was referred to a urologist who did an ultrasound scan of the abdomen, told him that he had an enlarged prostate gland, advised surgery, and a date was scheduled for the same. The patient asked, will the surgery cure my knee pain? Good question. The answer was no, but you need surgery for the enlarged prostate. The patient asked, I came for knee pain. You are asking me to undergo surgery for the prostate. How will it cure my knee pain? The doctor's answer was interesting. You go into your room, you hear some noise, you explore, and you find a thief hiding under the bed. Will you not tackle him? The patient changed the doctor immediately. What went wrong here was that the patient's presenting complaint was not addressed by the treatment that was suggested. The patient was a known diabetic on irregular treatment. The doctor did not ask him details about past illness. The increased urinary frequency was due to uncontrolled diabetes. And after proper treatment for diabetes, there were no further urinary symptoms. With lifestyle modification, the 5 kg weight loss, the knee pain actually got much better to the extent he was able to attend to his day-to-day needs. The patient almost had a needless operation. Take a full history and do not act in haste. Do not forget the presenting complaint. The disease spell is something that patients come with, makes not only the patient dizzy, but also the attending physician. A 48-year-old businessman from Mumbai presented with dizzy spells for 6 months. He had consulted a neurologist. No obvious neurological abnormality was detected. He underwent the routine, an MRI, an MR angio, EEG, EMG, nerve conduction velocity for good measure. And apart from a small lacunar stroke in the brainstem, no other abnormality was noted. He was told that he had reduced blood flow to certain parts of the brain, and that was what was making him dizzy. He was started on aspirin, but his symptoms persisted, so he came for a second opinion. A more detailed history was obtained. During these episodes of dizzy spells, he would function automatically. He was unaware of what he was doing, and the episode used to last for several hours. And the dizzy spells were periods of which the patient had no recollection. He had a loss of memory for these periods. And the symptoms had started after the recent economic recession, in which his company made heavy losses, and he took this very badly. The diagnosis actually was a dissociative state, a fugue episode, when everything is foggy in the brain for a few hours. A psychiatrist was consulted. He was just started on psychotherapy. He is doing very well now. Details of the presenting complaint are vital to arriving at a decent diagnosis. There was a great surgeon in Vellore, Paul Brandt, internationally well-known hand surgeon. He had one line that still lives long after he passed away. Pain is God's gift to mankind. The patient's pain is actually a special gift to clinicians as well, because pain is one of the most common symptoms with which patients come to doctors. A correct interpretation of the pain is vital for arriving at a diagnosis. You need to actively and patiently listen to the patient's description of his pain in order to unravel the diagnosis. We had this patient with chest pain who also had diabetes and hypertension. A 50-year-old male, diabetic for 5 years, hypertensive for 7 years, had left-sided severe chest pain for a day, was seen in the emergency. There were non-specific T-wave changes. Troponin was negative. He was admitted for observation. Now, when he went on rounds, he was sitting on his bed without his shirt. When we asked him why he was there without his shirt, he said he cannot tolerate the contact of clothes with his chest wall. He said he gets stinging pain from back to front. Examination, the skin over the area where he complained of pain was hyperesthetic. What would you think of the situation? This is what happened the next day. The patient broke out into a very typical rash, conclusive of a diagnosis of herpes zoster. So what the patient had, a pre-herpetic neuralgic pain, and this was sorted out by just asking him why he was not wearing a shirt. Now, there are patients who come with chest pain due to other causes. One of the causes, as you all know, is pleuritic pain, very common cause for chest pain. A 14-year-old lady was admitted with chest pain and dyspnea. Clinical examination showed a left pleural effusion, found to have a nodule in the neck. The registrar who presented the case said the patient has a tuberculous pleural effusion and tuberculous lymphadenitis in the neck. During rounds, this lady was sitting up in bed. The resident said she is sitting up because she is breathless because of the pleural effusion. But when we asked her, the youngster said lying down actually worsens the pain. The only comfortable position was sitting up, sitting almost doubled up. What would you suspect? Pain relieved by sitting doubled up in bed occurs with pancreatitis. This patient's amylase was 800 units, serum calcium was 9.5, the pleural fluid was hemorrhagic, pleural fluid amylase was more than 2000. Patient definitely had an acute pancreatitis, and the left pleural effusion was a consequence of the pancreatitis. What about the neck node? Do you know what the node was? It was on the side of the trachea. It was moving well with deglutition, and the nodule indeed was a parathyroid adenoma. She had hypercalcemia, which was concealed by the occurrence of pancreatitis. Diagnosis of hyperparathyroidism was established. She had surgery. The resected specimen is shown on the right-hand side in the slide. The final diagnosis was hyperparathyroidism, hypercalcemia causing pancreatitis. Patient had surgery. Been under follow-up for 40 years. She remains very well, but she has mild diabetes because of past pancreatitis. Headache is another common complaint with which patients come to hospital. And as you all know, one of the most common causes for headache when you see a patient in the outpatient department would be migraine. A 60-year-old lady with diabetes and hypertension with a past history of a migraine headache for more than 30 years had a very severe episode with vomiting which brought her to hospital. She was admitted, evaluated. Her blood pressure curiously remained normal throughout her stay in the hospital. Her anti-diabetic drug requirement actually came down during hospital stay. She was actually managed as a patient with migraine and well-controlled sugars, even without anti-diabetics, were attributed to the vomiting and poor food intake. Once vomiting resolved, she was discharged. The patient was still not feeling all right and so came for a second opinion. On probing, she said, "This was the worst headache I have ever had. I used to have migraine before, but this headache was very different. Now, after this episode, my appetite is gone. I have low sugar symptoms and don't need my anti-diabetic drugs anymore. I used to take blood pressure tablets. I don't need them anymore." And these are all clues to a diagnosis. Severe headaches, propensity for low sugars, and low blood pressure readings were actually the clues. The patient had hypopituitarism. Cortisol was low at 3 microgram per deciliter. Free thyroxine was low. TSH was low. And for a postmenopausal lady, an FSH of 2.5 was quite low. All these features confirmed the clinical impression of hypopituitarism derived from the history. And when you have severe headache followed by acute onset hypopituitarism, you think about a vascular event that has happened in the pituitary, like a pituitary apoplexy. And this is what the imaging showed. As you can see here, you find an enlarged pituitary gland with the upper margin extending beyond the upper margin of the sella turcica, impinging on the optic chiasma. And inside this pituitary tumor, there are very distinct altered area which represents hemorrhage. So this patient had a pituitary apoplexy due to a bleed into a pre-existing pituitary macroadenoma. A diagnosis was confirmed. She was started on replacement with hydrocortisone and thyroxine. Within a month, she was back to normal and she started requiring her usual antihypertensive, anti-diabetic medication. She is doing well now, 10 years after initial visit. And the repeat imaging actually shows an empty sella. The apoplexy had actually cured the pituitary tumor. Now, when you have a patient with pain, what relieves pain is a very important thing that you need to inquire into. A 50-year-old male with headaches for a year, mild unsteadiness while walking, had severe holocranial headache, sometimes with nausea, occasionally with vomiting. There were no localizing symptoms, not a known hypertensive. But during the episodes of headache, he used to have blood pressure readings that were a bit high, 170 to 180 by 90, with a pulse rate that was relatively low, 50 to 60 per minute. And pulse and blood pressure were generally normal when he was free from headache. Professor K.V. Mathai had seen him in the outpatient department. He was professor of neurosurgery in CMC hospital, and he had admitted him to the ward. We were residents then, and we were asked to examine the patient. The patient had a little imbalance while walking. Fundus examination showed a full optic cup with a hyperemia of the disc margin, but no overt papilledema. The rest of the neurologic examination was normal, and these details were presented during rounds to Professor Mathai. Professor Mathai asked the patient only one question: is there anything that relieves your headache? What the patient did next gave us the diagnosis. The patient went into this position, the typical namaz position with the head down. And this was the position that gave this patient relief from headache. And this symptom is typical of this lesion that you see in the midline in the third ventricle. The colloid cyst in the third ventricle, which is causing intermittent obstruction of the aqueduct of Sylvius and causing episodes of severe headache and vomiting. And when he leans forward, the tumor moves away from the aqueduct, pressure is relieved, and the patient has no pain. Let us come down to earth from rare problems to common problems. We always need to get to the root of the patient's pain. It is not enough if we make a physical diagnosis of pain arising from this structure or that structure, but we need to go to the root cause of the pain. A 40-year-old lady brought by her daughter, a physiotherapist, had lower abdominal pain, which was deep-seated in the pelvis, had been there for 7 years. She had normal menstrual cycles, which were regular, no exacerbation of pain during periods. The pain used to last throughout the day and night. The pain was worse at night and her sleep was disturbed. She had seen numerous doctors, and in the last visit, an ultrasound examination of the abdomen and a transvaginal ultrasound had shown a 5-centimeter subserosal uterine fibroid, and she was advised hysterectomy. She was relieved that finally some cause had been found for her pain, but she herself was not sure in her mind, so she wanted a second opinion. When she came to us, she appeared distressed, depressed, and anxious. It was obvious that the pain was not due to the fibroid. A subserosal fibroid of 5 centimeter diameter does not cause a prolonged history of abdominal pain. We said it may be something else. We prescribed a mild anxiolytic and told her to come for a follow-up. 2 months later, her daughter brought her back, saying that she is sleeping better, but the pain is persisting. This time, I noticed something that I had not noticed the first time, that only the daughter was coming with the patient. I asked the patient, "How come your husband has not come?" She immediately broke down and started weeping. I asked the daughter to leave and interviewed this lady along with the nurse. The lady came up with the diagnosis. She said, "My husband is addicted to alcohol. I am the subject of verbal and physical abuse. My daughter has grown up and she has left home. I am alone in my suffering. I can't even share it with anybody." She did not want to upset her daughter. Her pain was very genuine, but it is certainly not due to the fibroid. No investigation on earth can lead you to this diagnosis. Only a good history can. We have a de-addiction program in our hospital. We sent our counselor to talk to the husband. He enrolled in the program and has been staying off alcohol for the last 2 years. And at the last follow-up, this lady was really beaming. She had come to invite me to her daughter's wedding. We always need to pay attention to the situation in which the patient's symptoms started. We need to pay attention to how, where, and when symptoms started. This happened when I was actually a postgraduate student, but I vividly remember this patient. 34-year-old brought to casualty with severe breathing difficulty. He had a fast respiratory rate of 40 per minute. He had tachycardia. He was hypotensive. He had cellulitis of the right leg with redness and local warmth. Tentatively, we diagnosed him to have a sepsis syndrome and septic shock. He started the patient on IV fluids and antibiotics after appropriate tests. But over the next 2 hours, his tachypnea worsened and his saturation dropped. He was admitted to ICU. He was intubated, connected to a ventilator. There was something that did not really fit in. This is what the leg looked like: angry, blistering, red, edematous, typical of cellulitis. The history was reviewed with the wife of the patient. This patient was a manual laborer. He was completely all right the previous day. There was no injury at workplace. He woke up at 4 a.m. with a pain in the right leg. He became breathless within the next 30 minutes. This sequence is too rapid for a sepsis syndrome. And we found that he was sleeping outdoor on the ground. What would you think of? Snake bite. So what was suspected? He had grossly deranged coagulation parameters. He was started on polyvalent antivenin. And over the next 3 days, his respiratory paralysis, which was actually due to snake bite, gradually resolved. But for the details of the setting in which his symptoms started, we would have completely missed the diagnosis. It's very important to assess the socio-cultural setting in which a medical problem occurs. If the proper sequence of events had not been elicited, we would have lost this patient. Very often, a physician in the outpatient is confronted with a situation where he has to consider and entertain a psychiatric diagnosis. A 32-year-old lady with a 3-year history of altered behavior was told that she had a psychiatric problem outside. She had multiple hospital visits without a clear diagnosis. The husband, however, was not convinced about the diagnosis and wanted a second opinion. We went a little bit more into the details of her history. She had poor appetite, had recurrent bouts of diarrhea, vomiting for the last 1 year. Even after a couple of bouts of vomiting, she would become very sick. She had 5 admissions for intravenous fluid because BP was very low. She had lost 10 kgs weight and she was weak for the last 1 year. The only question we asked her was when she was completely all right, because it seemed to be a chronic problem. They said menstrual cycles had ceased for the last 6 years. 6 years earlier, after a second delivery, she had severe postpartum hemorrhage, needed 10 transfusions, failed to lactate and menstruate after the last delivery. A completely giveaway diagnosis, very easy diagnosis. But if you hadn't asked that question, we wouldn't have got this history and we would have also sent her without a diagnosis. These details led to a diagnosis of pituitary deficiency due to severe postpartum bleeding, Sheehan syndrome. Diagnosis was confirmed, treatment was started, patient is well and fully functional 20 years after diagnosis. So please remember, when somebody is sent to you with a label of a psychiatric problem, be sure that you are not missing something organic. It's always a good question to ask the patient when the patient was completely well and what was the setting which sort of set off the train of symptoms over the years. The past history, sequence of events in the history, menstrual history were the main clues to the diagnosis of this patient. And the question asked, when was she last well, brought out all the answers. Very important sometimes for a physician to ask himself, why is it that this patient has actually come to me? What does this patient want out of this particular consultation? This question is something that's very important to ask. A 28-year-old lady with a 4-year history of diabetes had high blood sugar levels of 250 to 300, never had ketosis. She had had recurrent genital tract fungal infections in the past. She had not received insulin so far. She was on metformin for the initial 1 year, but control was poor. She was consulted about diet, exercise, and a sulfonylurea was added. Glycemic control improved and was very good. She had no complications of diabetes. But yet, she sought a second opinion. Why did she want a second opinion? When we asked her why your diabetes under control, what do you want out of this consultation? She said, I'm planning to get married and I was worried. We told her your glycemic control is good. If you want to marry and raise a family, go ahead, no problem. She asked, will my child get this problem? When asked why she had this doubt, she said, diabetes runs in several generations in our family, and a number of us have had diabetes before the age of 30. Now, that is a very important clue. This statement of hers gave us the diagnosis. We drew a family tree and found that she was right. There is a type of diabetes in the young due to a single gene defect, which you are all aware of, maturity onset diabetes of the young, which is inherited as an autosomal dominant trait. What difference does this make? They often managed with oral medication for years on end, like in this lady. Genetic counseling is important because each offspring has a 50% chance of getting the problem. This is the precise bit of information that this patient wanted out of the consultation. What is the chance of my baby getting it? What should I do? It is important to figure out why a patient seeks a consultation. She was not worried too much about her diabetes. She knew it was under good control. She was worried that her children may get it and may get it when they were young. In fact, Modi was described after a very careful study of families. The genetic defect was found much later. Why should you talk to immediate family members? 50-year-old male brought to emergency with double vision. He developed symptoms at his workplace and his friends brought him. Had been feeling unsteady for 2 days. He had fallen down, but he had no head injury. Had been vomiting on and off for the last 3 days. Had started talking irrelevantly from the morning after he arrived at work, and he was quite confused. No fever or headache. Provisionally, a neurological problem was suspected. Is it a transient ischemic attack? Is it an intracranial space-occupying lesion? And he had fallen down. Did he sustain an injury that led to a subdural hematoma? These were the things that passed through our minds when the patient was brought. On examination of the afebrile, vital signs were normal. He was restless, disoriented, garrulous. He made statements which were not substantiated by his friends. He was telling us tall stories. Eye movements were restricted on lateral gaze. There was mild nystagmus. He was ataxic when he tried to walk. There was no neck stiffness. An MRI of the brain had been done in another center, and he had brought it along with him. That was quite normal. His friends who brought him were not very informative, so we said we need to talk to a family member. His wife appeared on the scene, and she seemed very distressed. He kept on saying he brought it upon himself. So we asked her, why do you say that? He said he was addicted to alcohol. With the onset of vomiting, his alcohol consumption stopped abruptly. He was given intravenous fluid because of vomiting, and after the IV fluid was started, his symptoms became much worse. With these details, the diagnosis was fairly straightforward. He had a probable Wernicke's encephalopathy. Remember, thiamine levels are not measured in the usual clinical laboratory, and very occasional research laboratories make this measurement. But that is what the patient had, an acute thiamine deficiency. But alcohol addiction, symptoms worsening after IV fluids, give away the diagnosis. He was given intravenous thiamine along with IV fluids, required sedation, recovered fully within 48 hours. If his wife had not come to give detailed diagnosis in this patient, would have been missed. Please remember, alcohol addiction is very common. And if you want to get details about alcohol, the patient is often a person who will not admit to heavy consumption of alcohol. You need to ask from somebody close, like the spouse. The other people, friends, and so on, may not have any knowledge about this, or even if they knew, they may not divulge this. Very important to have some idea about what the patient is doing for a living, and this comes in handy in arriving at a diagnosis in certain situations. A 28-year-old male had come with severe abdominal pain, had been symptomatic for 3 months. The pain was poorly localized, colicky. It had similar bouts of pain on 2 previous occasions. She had been admitted for this pain. It had a number of tests, x-rays, and scans. No definite diagnosis had been arrived at. One of my very meticulous MD students took a very careful history of this patient. And during rounds, he said the patient's occupation is he's a casual laborer in a workshop. He gone a little bit greater into the detail, and he said the workshop actually melts down used car batteries and they sell the lead. Now, if this bit of information had not been available, we would have never arrived at a diagnosis of lead poisoning as a diagnosis in this patient, which was obvious from a very simple peripheral smear of the blood. You just look at these RBCs here, you find typical coarse basophilic stippling. We had a diagnosis looking at the peripheral smear. The peripheral smear also showed a microcytic hypochromic anemia, which is very common in lead poisoning. The blood levels of lead were elevated, 24-hour urine delta LA was elevated, all confirming a diagnosis of lead poisoning. This was diagnosed, treated. We educated his co-workers about personal protection, and we were able to help not just him, but all his co-workers as well. If occupational exposure to lead had been missed out, the diagnosis also would have been missed, and you would have gone from physician to physician seeking a diagnosis. Now, sometimes patients come to you with funny symptoms, unusual symptoms, and one of my patients who had butterflies in the stomach, a 45-year-old male, he came to me and he said, something is fluttering inside my stomach. And the episode used to last about 15 to 45 minutes. Had been a hypertensive for 5 years. suboptimal control on medication. Physical examination was normal. Blood pressure was 170/90. Pulse rate was unremarkable. Fundus did not show hypertensive changes. So I reassured him and I adjusted his medication and I told him, okay, come once in 3 months for a follow-up, monitor your blood pressure and come back to the reading. But every follow-up visit, his original symptom of butterflies in the stomach persisted. BP tended to fluctuate a bit, but it was under reasonable control. Now I could sense that he was slowly getting fed up with me. He come to me 4 times and he still had the butterflies in the stomach. So one visit, I asked him, how often do you get it? He said, I get it 2 to 3 times a day. He said, okay, you stay in the OPD for a day, and as soon as the butterflies start fluttering inside your stomach, you come into my room. He came into my room at 2 p.m. and said, I got it now. The pulse rate was 160, blood pressure was 200/120. The electrocardiogram done at that time showed a supraventricular tachycardia. So what the patient interpreted as butterflies in the stomach was actually a cardiac rhythm disturbance. Well, with the high blood pressure and the tachycardia, I thought I was dealing with a pheochromocytoma, and I was wrong. We did a secondary hypertension workup. VMAs were normal, but his potassium was very low. Serum potassium of 2.5. He had a mild alkalosis with a bicarb of 35. Urinary potassium was elevated. These were days when we did not have any measurements for aldosterone. But the typical biochemical abnormality along with the hypertension and no changes in the fundus is a very strong indicator of the presence of hyperaldosteronism. Even though we did not have aldosterone measurements in CMC at the time, we did have access to CT scan, and the CT scan showed bilateral adrenal enlargement with nodules. We started the patient on medical treatment for hyperaldosteronism with nifedipine and spironolactone, and he came in beaming after a month. His symptom had gone. Basically, that was what he had come with, butterflies in the stomach. You're not too bothered about his blood pressure and other things, but the butterflies in the stomach were worrying him and his symptom was gone, and therefore he was very happy. And the blood pressure also was under good control, potassium had normalized. Now he has been with me for the last 30 years, comes once a year for a follow-up. I told him you don't have to come. But he said, no, no, no. If I don't come and see you, the butterflies may come back. When patients complain of episodic funny symptoms, please believe them and do see them when they have the symptoms. If you're in a busy OPD, you just ask them to wait there and ask them to come in as soon as they have the symptom and examine them when they have the symptom. And these unusual symptoms may lead to unusual diagnoses. Now, there are many situations when we wonder what the patient consumed to develop a particular medical problem. And here are 2 such cases. A 50-year-old man who presented with restlessness for 3 months, had insomnia. He kept pacing up and down. He consulted a neurologist. The neurologist found tremor and a little rigidity. The diagnosis of Parkinsonism. It was explained to him that this is a slowly progressive disorder. Now, this explanation left the patient even more upset. His symptoms became worse, and the drugs prescribed actually augmented his mental confusion. And he came for a second opinion. So when he talked to the patient, he said he had started when he went on a visit to US to see his daughter. Initially, he suffered from some jet lag. The food was too rich. He had epigastric and retrocell burning. He consulted a gastroenterologist. He had an upper GI endoscopy which showed reflux esophagitis. He was prescribed some tablets, and he continued to take them because his reflux symptoms were relieved. He was prescribed for 6 weeks, but he had been on it for about 6 months. His restlessness and insomnia persisted, and he thought US does not agree with him, so he returned to India, but he continued taking his tablets and continued to have the symptoms. The medication prescribed was metoclopramide. Known side effects: restless legs, dystonia, tremor, Parkinsonian features. The drug was withdrawn and symptoms resolved over the next 1 month. Drugs can cause symptoms of all known naturally occurring diseases. Please remember that. A detailed drug history is extremely valuable in coming to a clear diagnosis in difficult situations. A 60-year-old businessman from Vellore was admitted with severe weakness and bleeding gums because of his problems, he was admitted in a medical unit. He was found to have a hemoglobin of 8 grams per deciliter. A WBC count and platelet counts were also low. These were days when the hematology department had not been started in CMC. He was suspected to have an aplastic anemia. Reasonable diagnosis considering that all 3 series in the peripheral smear were suppressed. The bone marrow showed features of marrow hypoplasia. The treatment options that were being considered at that time included transfusions, giving male sex hormones, which was a recognized form of treatment then and even now. And if unresponsive, well, maybe think about bone marrow transplant. Now, they sent a consultation to me because there's something that they felt may not be exactly correct. The patient had a chronic skin problem in addition. And when I talked to him, he said he had been on a Siddha drug for skin problems for the last 2 years. In fact, he pulled it out from his pocket. I got the drug and read the label, and the stated content of the preparation was gold, copper, and lead. This is Baspam. And we all know that gold is known to suppress bone marrow. We also know it can damage the kidney. Now, this drug was discontinued forthwith, and over the next 6 months, he made a full recovery from his hematological problem without any additional treatment. Our drug history, therefore, should be comprehensive and should not be limited only to allopathic drugs. Please remember, in our country, there are many systems of medicine that are being practiced, and patients take different types of medicine. Sometimes they take combinations of all medicines. So you need to be aware of this, and as far as possible, get all the drugs, just go through them, inspect the labels, and see what they contain. They may have very valuable information for you to arrive at a diagnosis. Well, to conclude, we live in an era where imaging is very advanced. A 1 centimeter lesion or even a sub-centimeter lesion anywhere in the body can be picked up by various scans. The problem that you face is whether these lesions are responsible for the patient's symptoms. This conclusion can only be arrived at if one puts the history together with the findings, together with whatever abnormality is there on imaging, to see if the whole thing makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, then you don't have a diagnosis. If we fail to do this synthesis, a lot of patients will get a lot of tests and undergo a lot of unnecessary surgical procedures. We see it happening now. Clinicians should see the way pathologists work. The pathologists first look at the gross specimen. They look at it under the low power then. And finally, an area of interest may be looked at with a high power. If the sequence is reversed, it can lead to chaos. In clinical medicine, you need to take a good history. Next, you need to do a proper physical examination. Then order relevant investigations and imaging and interpret them in the light of the history and physical examination. Reversing the sequence in clinical medicine also leads to chaos. The moral of the story that I have told you just now, when you have an unusual clinical presentation, you need to go back to the bedside and figure out what you have missed out in the history. In all the challenging diagnostic puzzles I have been called upon to handle in the last 40 years, I find revisiting the patient's history is the most important tool, not laboratory tests or imaging. I had a very favorite cardiology professor in CMC, Professor George Cherian. Now, he had this one line which I can never forget. The availability of sophisticated diagnostic tests should not obviate the need for a detailed history and a comprehensive physical examination. And you must see Professor George Cherian delivering this to student after student who went through him. And this is one line from him that people will never forget. And this is one line I make sure I teach all my students. You all know Tirukkural. நோய் நாடி நோய் முதல் நாடி அது தணிக்கும் வாய் நாடி வாய்ப்பச் செயல். You also know the meaning. What is the disease? What is the root cause of the disease? What is the remedy? And will the patient tolerate the remedy? A fantastic line that was actually that, many decades before the Christian era, 31 BCE. Consider all this before you treat. Thiruvalluvar was spot on, 100% correct. Now, Auguste Francois Chomel, 1788-1858, said, primum non nocere, means primarily do no harm. You may not do good, that doesn't matter. Plus, do no harm. The essential principle of Hippocratic medicine is do no harm. If you want to do no harm, you need a good clinical history. Thank you very much for a patient listening.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for this wonderful lecture, sir. We are honored and privileged to have heard it from you. Thank you again, sir. At the outset now, I would also extend our felicitations both from the API Trichy and IMA Trichy to sir for this wonderful lecture. A few words from the IMA Secretary, Dr. Senthilvel Kumar, sir, and Dr. Ravi, sir, before we go forward.
Unmute Shakti.
Yeah, done, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Seshadri, sir. It had been a wonderful presentation, very exemplary. And we felt it is the need of the hour, especially to all of us, not only to the younger generation, to all of us. With the available sophisticated investigations, sometimes we go in a shortcut to make a faster diagnosis. But you have really advised us to follow the route properly, go to a correct diagnosis and manage the patients. We are really very much honored by your presentation, sir. Thank you very much, sir. One of the exemplary presentations in this year. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I now call upon Ravi, sir?
Very excellent lecture, sir, Dr. Seshadri. All the cases are coming to our practice. All these cases you have presented. Recently, I have done a surgery for recurrent pancreatitis. The cause is parathyroid tumor. Like that, so people coming from US, there the metoclopramide is over the counter available. It is right and left prescribed there. That is a common problem when people are coming from US. So very good lecture, sir. Thank you for your lecture.
Ravi, sir, is a gastroenterologist, sir. So.
Thank you.
And may I have the honor of welcoming Dr. Vivek Sundaram. A few words from Dr. Vivek Sundaram and Dr. Gunasekharan, sir, and Dr. Ashraf, sir.
Thank you, sir, for this excellent lecture. I would say it was a great tribute on this endowment lecture, and it was a really enlightening and very thought-provoking lecture. And this is one of those memorable lectures we will always keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Dr. Vivek is a son of Dr. Sundaram, sir.
Very, very nice to meet you. And I have heard about Professor Sundaram, Dr. Sundaram. This is from the olden days when he used to refer patients to CMC hospital. I know him from that time.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, sir, for acknowledging.
Dr. Gunasekharan, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for the wonderful lecture, and it is thought-provoking. And we believe in taking history before we go into the sophisticated investigation. As you advised, definitely it will be useful for all the physicians, especially to the younger generation, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Dr. Ashraf, sir, if sir is available. Fine, sir. If anyone else wants to place their regards to sir, most welcome. Any questions on the same is also welcome.
Can I interview Sakti?
Yeah.
Yes, that's my dad, Dr. Shiva. Please go ahead.
It is a very, very fitting topic because I started my MBBS with Sundaram and he was very, very particular about history taking. He's an excellent clinician with a lot of emphasis on history taking. This is excellent tribute, Dr. Sundaram. Thank you, Secretary. Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank you.
Shiva, the close friend of Dr. Sundaram, sir.
Yeah, classmates.
Classmates.
May I now call upon anyone to pay tribute to Dr. Sundaram, sir? Apart from his family members, anyone else who wants to pay tribute to sir is most welcome now.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, sir, please.
Okay, sir.
See, when I did my MBBS in Coimbatore Medical College, my professor there, Professor T.K. Ganesan, Professor K. Padmanabhan, Professor Muniratnam Shetty, Professor Srihari, and Professor Jagadish Chandra, 5 physicians. And all that I learned during those 5 years are very clearly imprinted in my mind. Those were times when laboratory tests were very scarce. If you wanted to have a look at a peripheral smear, you had to make a peripheral smear and you had to have a look at it and have it ready for the professor to have a look after rounds. And that training is what has given me a clear insight into the art of practicing medicine, undergraduate training. I feel that this system of undergraduate training, where experienced physicians with excellent clinical skills and remarkable skills in history taking teach young medical students, that tradition is what will make sure that we do the right thing by our patients. I would like to make a tribute to all my teachers who have made me what I am. At this time when Dr. Sundaram is remembered by his students for his interest in teaching them basic history taking and clinical examination.
Thank you so
In a
much,
way-
sir. It's an honor, sir.
1 minute. In a way, sir, the medical profession is being bombarded due to overintelligence in investigations. If you properly take a very, very nice history, the need for such advanced investigations may come down, once again bringing a good name to the profession. I think it should be insisted upon during the college days itself.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir,
Anyone-
one of my patients, is a good friend of mine. Once he told, when I was referring him to a physician, he was telling me, sir, don't refer me to a very busy physician who sees 100 cases a day. He will not spend time with me and elicit proper history. Refer to me who is academically very good, very, very knowledgeable, but has little practice. Little practice means a moderate practice, so that he will spend some time for me listening to my chronic non-healing problem. This was a comment by one of my patients, which I would like to share in this august audience. Nowadays, patients themselves, they have understood that the busy practitioners, they don't spend time with the patients. So they are asking for sophisticated investigation for a faster diagnosis. And we have to accept that also, I think. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
It is partially true, because when working in government hospital, we used to see 100 cases per day.
Yes, sir.
So we developed skills of identifying a disease very fast. We have made
Exactly.
cobra bites when the patient was walking into the OP.
Yeah.
We have developed skills, so it is partially true. It
Yes.
need not be universal.
Yes. True, sir.
May now also call upon Dr. Prabhu Ilango, sir, Dr. Surendra Babu, sir, and Dr. Devanathan, sir, to give their thoughts as well, senior doctors.
To talk about Dr. Sundaram itself is great. You see, whenever a case comes to him, he will first start with the history and he will come to a diagnosis with the history itself. And he will try to prove that diagnosis is correct by all investigations. Such a wonderful man, a good talk on history taking on his memorial day is
Yes, yes.
very, very
Fitting
realistic.
tribute.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
topic, a fitting tribute.
Fitting
Especially
tribute
a
to him, yeah.
teacher like Dr. Seshadri.
Yeah, that too particularly Dr. Shad, whom we meet in every meeting. Almost all Apicons and other meetings, we meet him. But we do not know, actually from somewhere away from CMC, I do not know where he is so much famous for history taking.
May I also call upon Dr. Prabhu Ilango sir and Dr. Devanathan sir?
Unmute. Unmute and talk, please.
Yeah, Dr. Sundaram is a very close friend of mine for several years, and I was his urologist for quite a long time. And my association with him is not only in the subject of urology, but also as and when I meet him, he used to tell me what are the interesting cases that he had seen that particular week, and how he went about investigating and evaluating the case, and how he arrived at a diagnosis. In fact, I learned is a good medical knowledge from Dr. Sundaram by way of my association. Dr. Sundaram, apart from general medicine, had a definite knowledge of, yeah, pardon? Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes, sir, you are, sir.
Yeah, I just want to say a few words about Dr. Sundaram. Dr. Sundaram, apart from the general medicine, he had shown keen interest in learning something about other subspecialties also. So with acquiring such knowledge of subspecialty, which is directly not connected to your area, adds more experience, more knowledge. More knowledge you acquire, you will definitely think about various aspects of the differential diagnosis and arrive at a definite diagnosis. Apart from all these medical knowledges that I have gained from Dr. Sundaram, personally, he's a very good friend of mine, and many a time, even today, I used to think of him. And of course, Vivek has taken up the correct way of his father, and he's doing an excellent job. And because of him, many of the lives have been saved in the present days. You know, he has been one of the experts in treating COVID. Wishing Dr. Vivek all the best. And we will remember Dr. Sundaram's contribution to the growth of medical knowledge in our city. That's my view. Thanks for giving an opportunity to say a few words about Dr. Sundaram.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, sir.
Sir, I am
Dr. Prabhu Ilango, Dr. Ponnaya, sir. May I call upon also other doctors who might like to present their observations as well?
I am Dr. Arunachalam. Can I speak?
Please, sir. Please go ahead, sir.
I am a retired professor of surgery. I had been in a medical college. My observation is that the present students, MBBS students, they study books, and they never go to the ward and touch the patient. And many a time, if they are compelled to come to the ward, and none of the professors are interested in teaching them also, but the present scenario is like that. They wanted to do MBBS only by studying the books. They don't discuss, and no clinical classes are being taken. And if at all somebody is taking clinics, these students are not interested. They want to have degree, they don't want to touch the patient. That is why, because they have less confidence in their life and practice, and they never touch the patient in the ward. That is an unfortunate way of practicing the present setup of students, and they particularly the students who are in a private medical colleges. So now this is a very important topic that everybody must practice, and they teach the students. They have to go to the ward where they have to take the classes. Instead of taking classes in the room, the teaching is when we were students and MBA students, all the time we were in the wards, not in the private room. This is the present scenario. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for your comments and observations, sir. May I now also call Dr. Prabhu Ilango, sir. And Dr. Ponnaya, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Very much, sir.
Hello. It's a great thing that the topic chosen for Dr. Sundaram Memorial Lecture. We used to meet a small group as physicians on alternate Fridays in our house. Whenever he presents a case, he will not give the diagnosis first. He will slowly build up the history and make us to ask questions about how to interrogate further. So with this, he slowly develops and he gives a investigation reports only in the end. So such a good clinician who relies more on history taking and examination of the patient. So I'm very thankful to the speaker for giving the appropriate lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Incidentally, it was Dr. Vivek Sundaram who decided on this topic that the art of history taking should be one as a tribute.
Very nice one.
Any other doctor who wants to pay his tribute or his observations is most welcome.
If I can make a comment.
Yes, sir.
Just a comment. There was a mention that in government medical colleges, you are exposed to a very large number of students, and that gives you a very remarkable opportunity to get to a diagnosis fairly quickly. I would say that is 100% correct. I studied in a government medical college as an undergraduate. That is why I mentioned that when I earlier spoke about it. That experience for 5 years was unique and cannot be replaced by anything else. Those are the early formative years of any doctor's career. And during that time, if you are influenced by exemplary teachers whom you take on as your role model, that actually helps a great deal in your career. I think one of the most important things that all associations, whether it is the IMA or whether it's the API, should consider seriously is to restore the grandeur of teaching in medical colleges. It has to be bedside. Somebody was saying students are trying to learn things only from books. Sir William Osler had a very nice quote about this. What he said was, if you want to learn medicine without books, it is like taking to the uncharted seas. But if you want to learn medicine without going to the bedside, it is like not going to sea at all. Okay. So if you really want to learn medicine, you need books, but you need the bedside far more.
Thank you, sir, for that excellent pearls of wisdom again. May I now, if there are no more people who want to talk, Dr. Prabhu Ilango, sir. Sir is putting up his hands, I guess. Fine, sir. So I think we'll go for the vote of thanks by Dr. Ponnaya, sir. Dr. Ponnaya, sir, if you are here, we'll go for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Saktivel. I thank the speaker for the excellent topic in memory of Dr. Sundaram. I also thank all the participants on behalf of APA Trichy and IMA Trichinopoli. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be here today. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Seshadri, sir. Thank you, Vivek Sundaram and his family as well. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Vivek. You have selected a correct topic. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. My pleasure, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great Sunday.